Hello, my wonderful viewers, and welcome to another episode of Betty Adams Overanalyzes. Today we look at Star Wars The Clone Wars, Season 7, Episode 10, The Phantom Apprentice. If the last few episodes were a little slow, this is the episode that makes them worth the wait. This is what the show was building towards. There are 100 wonderful things going on in this episode that drag your emotions around every which way. You truly do not know what is going to happen from moment to moment. The artistry of the imagery bleeds down from past centuries and summon ghosts of actual fallen empires and republics to bring this fallen resurrection to life. So, let's get to it. First, there is the pure artistic beauty of the episode. Do you know who Rembrandt was? He was a Dutch painter who lived and worked around the same time as Shakespeare did, roughly. He was a master of the art technique called chiaroscuro. I'm not too good with the Latin. The artist uses bold contrast between light and dark to bring some element of the painting into focus, usually a face. Rembrandt was most famous for his portraits of St. Paul, which were actually self-portraits of his. A gently smiling face of an old man stares out from the mass of shadows. The point of chiaroscuro is to make the image seem to pop in 3 dimensions. It is beautiful, and it brings the face into sharp focus. This focus was no problem for Rembrandt because he belonged to the Dutch Baroque style of art. He was dedicated to detail. You can see every hair, and only in his later works could you even see the brushstrokes. It didn't matter if the composition drew the eye to every line, because every line was exquisite. But then centuries passed with the invention of photography. There was no longer any need to master the detailed style that Rembrandt was famous for. Why pay for an exact replica of your face that it took months to make when a man with a camera could do the same thing in a few days? So the days of the Dutch Baroque were ushered into the age of Impressionism, into the days of Vincent van Gogh. Unlike the precise detail of Rembrandt, Van Gogh used broad brushstrokes. The features on his portraits were still well done. They captured the image of the model, but you could see each brushstroke. The oil paint was smeared across the canvas. However, Van Gogh and his contemporaries used the exact same patterns of chiaroscuro to bring his portraits into focus. Take, for instance, totally randomly, the portrait of one Otto von Bismarck, totally randomly, a prince, a duke, and a chancellor. Look at the portrait of him between the Prime Minister and Darth Maul on the screen. Note the blurriness, note the use of the mass of darkness behind him making the light on his face stand out. When that portrait was painted, the artist, one Franz von Lindbach, had more than enough skill and knowledge to make it come out like the old Rembrandts. He could have made it more detailed and accurate than any photograph of the time, but he chose not to. He chose to use a style that appeared simpler to evoke a sense of emotional connection with the audience. Now, look back at the Prime Minister of Mandalore. Note that his face, just like the Bismarck's, is brilliantly lit. Note that his face does not look terribly realistic. It looks like something that was painted. From the very first episode of the Clone Wars, they have had the ability to make the faces far more realistic than this without pushing the faces into the uncanny valley. So why in this episode, made a decade later, do they revert to this seemingly more primitive style? It's the same with Darth Maul. The red streaks on his face seem to have been painted on loosely with a brush. His face is lit with the same chiaroscuro. Why? It seems that the artists who have painted this episode for us are going to great lengths to form an emotional connection to a previous time. Look at the brushstrokes on the Prime Minister's face. That is not cheap CGI. That is a CGI artist pushing his skill to the limits in order to make something very complex look primitive. These modern-day artists are hearkening back to the early days of Impressionism. They are summoning the spirit of Vincent van Gogh and his liney self-portraits. They are hearkening back to the latter end of the 19th century, just before the great empires begin to come apart. Remember how I said there was no particular reason I chose the image of Otto von Bismarck to represent that era of Impressionism? Well, I am afraid I have deceived you. You see, good old Otto was a bit of an odd bird, a duke and a prince by birth. In his youth he was a wild man who rejected every trapping of a civilized gentleman and partied like a frat boy so hard he was kicked out of several countries. Then he grew up, settled down, got married, and focused on farming, which he did quite successfully. He joined politics. He fought in the great battles of his time as a general. And at the end of his life, he gave a warning. He said, Jinnah came 20 years after the death of Frederick the Great. The crash will come 20 years after my departure if things go on like this. And his prediction came true to within a month. 20 years later, when, as he had put it, some damned thing happened in the Balkans, the Great European War was set off exactly as Otto had predicted. I cannot think it is a coincidence that the artists used the art style of Bismarck's time to present the two figures of the elder statesman and the brutal warrior, both elements of Bismarck's character, as both the Prime Minister of Mandalore and Darth Maul give these same kind of ominous warnings of what is to come. The fall of great institutions, the rise of new empires, shifts in power that would have been inconceivable to the galaxy just a few years before. These creators are tapping into a cultural memory and teasing at the threads of visual imagery and emotional resonance to craft a work of art, and that work hardly ends with these allusions to centuries past. Oh my goodness, sweet masters of Kung Fu, the choreography in this episode is magnificent! I am not a huge fan of fight scenes, I have to admit. It is usually something mildly amusing to get through while the plot advances for me. But Ahsoka and Darth Maul dance. Apparently the actor who played Darth Maul in the movies came back to provide the screen capture for these scenes. I can only express it, it's as if they are defying the laws of physics, but ultimately obeying them. At the same time that this is a beautiful dance, it is a brutal and realistic fight. In one moment, Darth Maul just straight up elbows Ahsoka's in the face like it's a street brawl. This was a fight staged by people who love to stage fights. The creator is yelling that he loves the shiny thing. Don't you love the shiny thing too? Yes, yes we do. And the characterization of Maul is just all around magnificent. He is manipulative, he is brutal, he is quite evil. However, the show does not let you forget for a moment that he was a child snatched from the arms of his loving brothers and indoctrinated into a cult. His attempts at seducing a new apprentice to the dark side seem more like a child desperate for any kind of touch and attention. He has come to the brutal realization that he is just a cog in a machine and has decided to lash out and spend the rest of his life trying to damage the gears that have ground him down. His fight against insignificance is truly pitiable. This contrasts against Ahsoka, who is also discovering that she has been used as a cog in a greater machine. She too has been ground down, but instead of lashing out in destruction, she is trying to rebuild something. But she is hampered by the blindness of her loyalty. When Darth Maul outlines what he suspects Darth Sidious to be up to with Anakin, Ahsoka simply refuses to believe him, even though she has seen more than enough evidence to realize the truth when he lays it out for her. But the deepest layer of tension comes from the layers of knowledge the fan has. Order 66 is coming, and from the moment Obi-Wan reveals that the Jedi Council has already set Anakin to spy on Emperor Palpatine and that Count Dooku is dead, you realize that you have no idea where in the timeline the Siege of Mandalore is. For the latter half of the show, you are filled with a sense of horrified dread every time Rex and the clones get close to Ahsoka. Will this be a moment? When they swoop in to save her from peril, a scene that should have nothing but expectation, you are terrified and scream for the clones who love her, the clones who all but raised her, to get away from her, and it is the most heartrending emotional dissonance I have ever experienced in a television show. The thought that at any moment she might have to kill some of these boys that she's so attached to is just gut-wrenching. So, what do you think, my wonderful viewers? Leave a like below if you agree with my analysis, and leave a comment blasting my commentary like the Death Star if you disagree. Hit that subscribe button below, and peace out, my wonderful viewers.